Hello, welcome to week 4 of EDUC 749. I hope you've had a great week and a good weekend and are getting geared up like I am to start another week. So we will jump into week 4. One of the things I wanted to highlight this week was some of the comments that were on your week 2 paper that I graded in week 3. But one of the things was one of the questions that you were to address in that paper was areas that you wanted to learn more about. And one of the things that I highlighted 2 of our colleagues here, and I took their names off just so since you were identifying areas you wanted to learn more about. But several of you mentioned IEPs, that you wanted to learn more about IEPs. This individual in the first statement wanted to learn about how to manage all of the necessary steps in the process of an IEP. And then our colleague that I highlighted at the bottom was interested in learning more about kind of how that flow happens from Tier 2 to Tier 3, then to an IEP, and also the legalities of an IEP, and some of the differences between an early childhood IEP and a transition IEP. Several of you commented that you learned in that module how involved parents are legally required to be in the IEP process, and that was great to see. So we will spend some time in this module talking about one component of IEPs, behavior primarily, but then in an upcoming module we'll dig into IEPs on a little bit more broad base. So I wanted to let you know that I appreciated your feedback about some areas you wanted to learn more about. One of the common themes I heard was IEPs, and so we will dig more into that in the coming modules. This is a visual. As we talk about IEPs, accommodations, modifications, some of those things that are important to be addressed, even services that we provide to our students with disabilities. Sometimes the question comes up of, well, is it fair? Is it fair to be doing that for this child when not every child is receiving that? And so this is one of the best visuals that I've seen that kind of highlights the difference between equality and equity. And so as we dig more deeply into services and accommodations that kids receive, I thought this is a really helpful visual. It is for me. I hope it is for you to kind of highlight when we're presented with those colleagues in our building that as we as special educators start talking about how to address kids' need, and maybe we hear that comment, well, shouldn't all kids get this? And why do they need this? Is that fair? This visual is a great way to highlight that. So you can see in this image, this is equal. Even though the students, the kids, are at different heights, what they're being provided is equal. They all got the same size box. So this is why when we talk about kids with disabilities, equality may not always be the right term, because equality means everybody gets the same thing. And as you can see in this picture, it doesn't really meet the needs of the child on the right. So in the second image here, you can see that they are given equitable treatment. So every child in this picture is given what they need. So the student on the left doesn't need anything to see over the fence. The student on the right, however, needs 2 boxes. And so that's oftentimes what we are focusing on in special education is equity, giving students the supports that they need, even though they may be very different across our classroom. So the final piece of this visual that I think really challenges us to take it to the next level is this picture. And especially when we think about universal design for learning that we have spoken about in previous modules, sometimes we need to just change the environment, change the way that we're providing our instruction. So as opposed to thinking about adding boxes so a student can see over the fence, just remove the fence or change the fence, make it a different way. And that's what we really need to be shifting our thinking to as we think about our instruction and our assessments. This goes back to what I've talked about before. The box in the middle, while it's great and it's equity, is accommodating after the fact. The picture on the right is changing the whole dynamic, change the entire environment to meet the needs of all learners. And so that's really what we need to look at. What are the barriers that we need to remove? How do we need to rethink our instruction? And I hope this visual kind of captures that for you. So in week 4, you will read 4 chapters, and they're primarily the chapters are kids with emotional and behavioral disabilities, kids with intellectual disabilities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism. So those are 4 just in very broad categories of our learners that you are going to be spending this week reading about and learning about. And so what I felt like the common theme in particularly 3 out of these 4 chapters is behavior. Students with intellectual disabilities may or may not have behavioral challenges. Same for students with autism spectrum. They may or may not fit your typical profile of a student with behavioral needs, but many times our students across these 4 categories do have behavioral needs that we're needing to identify either in the IEP or in the classroom for these students. And so rather than go into the nitty-gritty of each of these 4 categories, which you can do in the reading, I thought we would really focus on the common theme of behavior and what does that look like and how do we address that, knowing that particularly when we think about behavior, that's another great example of, while there might be certain things that are designed for kids with these disabilities, good behavioral practices apply across to all learners, whether they have a disability or not. So there are a couple of videos this week. One is a shorter video about from Swift that really challenges me to, I think it will challenge you too, about how we think about all students being successful in the general education classroom. And it shows some great examples of classroom adaptations, how we can use data, and some strategies that we can think about for intervention. So particularly as we think about some of our students who have an emotional behavioral disability, or our students with intellectual disabilities, that in many of our schools or in many of our backgrounds, those students might receive most of their education in a special ed classroom. The Swift video really challenges that thinking, that we need to make sure our students are being exposed to the general education classroom. Then the second video that you'll see is longer, but it talks about evidence-based behavioral interventions. And so it provides, it's a training that was done through a webinar kind of a thing, where some presenters talk about various behavioral interventions that are research-based. And so it really gets into what are those evidence-based practices that are rooted in research, but are also very practical for us in the classroom. And so what I like about this is it shows you through this legend that I've captured on this screen whether the practice has very convincing evidence and is strongly research-based, whether it has partial evidence supporting it, or really whether it's unconvincing evidence. And so, one of the things that I think we're challenged by in special education is we can't just always do what we've done, and that's what a lot of teachers do, and that's what a lot of people do with behavior, is just address it the way you've always done it. Well, our kids are changing, the needs of our students are changing, and so that research-based approach is really important, that we're sure that the practices that we're using are going to really change kids' behavior. So I think that I hope that you will find the presentation helpful, and then there's great resources that I'll ask you to click through as well to kind of get some information about various types of behavioral interventions. We've talked about this before, and I referenced this in several of your papers this past week, but just reminding us that if Tier 1 is not being successful, if 80% of our students are not being successful in the gen ed classroom, it's not a student problem, it's a teacher problem, it's a classroom problem. And I think one thing that we are really good at in schools is spending a lot of time figuring out Tier 2 and Tier 3 and how to get kids into special education and what that process needs to look like, when really we need to step back and go, are 80% of our students being successful in the gen ed classroom? If they're not, we shouldn't even be talking about Tier 2 and Tier 3. It's a core problem. And so some of the interventions that are talked about in that behavioral video are things like functional behavior assessments that are a part of a student's IEP, check in, check out, which I know has gotten a lot of attention, at least in the school districts that are around Indianapolis. We've seen a lot of that because it is a great research-based intervention that can be applied at all levels, K-12. And then non-contingent reinforcement, meaning you provide reinforcement often, and it is not necessarily tied to a target behavior. So, for example, you might do a functional behavior assessment and find that the function of that student's behavior is attention. The student just wants attention, and their behavior is being driven by getting that attention. So part of what you do is build attention into that student's day. They don't have to earn it. You're just giving them attention because you know that's what they need, and you're doing it throughout the day in a positive setting. So check in, check out is an example of that, because students don't have to earn it. They just get a little bit of attention in the morning to start their day off, a little bit of attention in the afternoon, maybe a midday check-in, and that's non-contingent reinforcement. So you're meeting the need that a child is displaying in their problem behavior before it's exhibited. So those are some of the strategies that you'll learn about in the video today, or the video this week, and also some other ones as well. So 4 things to work on this week. One is a discussion on cultural capital. There's a short video to watch and some resources to read there for that response, your initial response, and then your responses to your colleagues. There's a case study that's due at the end of the week. There are 3 different examples, case studies. Pick one that most interests you, and then certainly work on that. Let me know if you have any questions on that. This is week 4, so there is a devotion. One of the things I like about how ONU is doing their devotions this semester is it really is tied into the specific topics that we're covering. So in this devotion, he talks about sympathetic consciousness and us focusing on some of the most vulnerable individuals in our society that are most often overlooked. And so the fact that you are seeking to learn more about students with disabilities, a group of kids that we know are sometimes overlooked in our schools, I thought this really resonated in me, and I think that it'll resonate with you as well. One thing I'd like for you to do this week is send me an email after you've watched the behavior video. Send me an email or a Canvas message about what evidence-based interventions you learned about this week that you intend to use with your students. So I know some of you are in special ed classrooms, some of you are not, but I know you're all dealing with behavior. So one of the things I'd like to hear from you after you go through this module is, what is 1 or 2 things that you learned that you can take and use in your classrooms right away pertaining to behavior? So send me an email about that or a message, and I'm interested in hearing about that. I also just wanted to bring your attention to make sure to look ahead at week 8. We are at the halfway point. If you haven't looked at the final project, which is a second voice presentation, be sure to do that. Week 8 sneaks up very quickly in these courses, and so I just want to make sure that you are looking ahead at that project and knowing that you'll need to produce a presentation in some format. Voiceover is preferred so that we can really gain your knowledge about the topic, and that you're going to become a part of a cultural group that we've talked about. So talking about that group's history, the challenges, barriers that they have faced, current trends, and how through this class you've learned to address this group in your teaching. So that's looking ahead at week 8. I just wanted to bring that to your attention so that that's on your radar. That's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great week.